The memory sits in my mind like a scar that never quite healed, the kind that aches when the weather turns cold or when silence gets too heavy to bear. I was there that Tuesday morning, sitting 3 booths down from where it happened, nursing lukewarm coffee and watching the rain streak down the windows of Sal's diner. The place smelled like bacon grease and old coffee, the kind of smell that clings to your clothes long after you leave. I didn't know the elderly woman at the counter personally, but I'd seen her before, always alone, always quiet, always ordering the same thing: scrambled eggs, wheat toast, black coffee. She had that particular kind of stillness that comes with loss, the type that settles into your bones after burying someone you loved. Her hands trembled slightly as she counted out exact change from a small coin purse, her weathered fingers sorting through nickels and dimes with the careful precision of someone living on a fixed income. The waitress, a young woman named Beth, smiled at her with genuine warmth, one of those rare kindnesses you don't see much anymore. That's when Derek Mullins walked in, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. He wasn't alone. He had 2 others with him, both younger, both wearing the same cocky smirk that comes from never having faced real consequences. Derek was known around town as Trouble, the kind of man who dealt pills out of his car and thought that made him somebody important. He had a reputation for pushing people around, especially those who couldn't push back. At 6'2" with a build that suggested more time at the gym than at any honest work, he carried himself like a king surveying his territory. His eyes swept the diner with casual contempt, landing on each patron as if calculating their net worth and deciding whether they deserved his attention. When those eyes settled on the elderly woman at the counter, something cruel flickered across his face. An opportunity, a target, entertainment for his audience. I felt my stomach tighten with the premonition of something terrible about to unfold. That sick feeling you get when you know violence is coming, but you're frozen, watching it approach like a slow-motion car crash. The woman was standing now, having paid her bill, carefully tucking her coin purse back into her worn handbag. She moved with the deliberate slowness of advanced age, each motion considered and cautious. Derek deliberately stepped into her path as she turned to leave, forcing her to stop abruptly or collide with him. She looked up at him with confusion, not fear, not yet, just the bewilderment of someone who couldn't understand why a stranger would block her way. He said something to her I couldn't quite hear from where I sat, but I saw her face change, saw the flush of embarrassment color her pale cheeks. She tried to step around him, but he moved again, blocking her path once more. His friends laughed, that ugly sound of hyenas emboldened by pack mentality. The few other patrons in the diner shifted uncomfortably, eyes down, nobody wanting to get involved, a pattern I'd seen too many times before in this town, where people had learned to mind their own business the hard way. Beth, the waitress, stopped what she was doing, her hand frozen on the coffee pot, her young face registering the same helpless uncertainty that paralyzed the rest of us. What happened next changed everything. Derek reached out and flicked the woman's handbag, knocking it from her frail grip. It hit the floor with a dull thud, contents spilling across the worn linoleum, the coin purse, a small packet of tissues, a worn photograph in a plastic sleeve, reading glasses in a battered case, a rosary with faded beads. She bent down slowly, painfully, to gather her belongings, her dignity crumbling with each item she retrieved. Derek stood over her, saying something that made his friends laugh harder. Then, as she straightened up with great effort, clutching her handbag to her chest like a shield, he did the unthinkable. He slapped her across the face, not hard enough to knock her down, but hard enough to snap her head to the side, hard enough that the sound of it cracked through the diner like a gunshot. Hard enough that the red imprint of his hand bloomed immediately on her pale, thin skin. The elderly woman staggered, caught herself against the counter, one trembling hand rising to touch her struck cheek. Her eyes were wide with shock and humiliation, glistening with unshed tears that she refused to let fall. In that moment, looking at her face, I saw something that made my blood run cold, not just pain or fear, but a deep, profound sadness that spoke of a lifetime of losses I couldn't begin to imagine. The diner had gone completely silent except for the hiss of the grill and the rain against the windows. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Derek and his friends swaggered out, laughing like they'd just pulled off the prank of the century, oblivious to the line they'd just crossed. Beth rushed over to help the woman, but she waved her away gently, collecting herself with a dignity that was heartbreaking to witness. She straightened her coat, picked up her handbag, and walked out of that diner with her head high, refusing to let them see her broken. I sat there, my coffee now cold, my hands clenched into fists under the table, hating myself for my cowardice, for my silence, for being just another witness who did nothing. The other patrons slowly returned to their meals, to their conversations, letting the moment pass like it was just another piece of ugly business in a world full of ugly business. But I couldn't shake it. I couldn't shake the image of that handprint on her face, the sound of the slap, the tears she wouldn't let fall. I didn't know then that what I'd witnessed would ripple outward like a stone thrown into still water, creating waves that would eventually crash back with devastating force. I learned her name later that day, Eleanor Castellano. She lived alone in a small house on Maple Street, the kind of modest home that spoke of a simple life lived without pretense. Her husband had died 15 years earlier, a factory worker who'd given her 43 years of marriage before a heart attack took him in his sleep. They'd had one child, a son, who'd left town decades ago and rarely came back. Or so the neighborhood gossip went. Nobody knew much about him except that he'd gone east, made something of himself, sent money back to his mother regularly, but almost never visited. Eleanor didn't talk about him much, and people had learned not to ask. She was a fixture in the neighborhood, the kind of person you'd see at the corner market buying just enough for one, at church every Sunday morning sitting in the same pew, at the diner every Tuesday and Thursday for breakfast. She volunteered at the library, read to children on Saturday mornings, and tended a small garden behind her house where she grew tomatoes and herbs that she'd share with neighbors. She was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of person who deserved to live out her final years in peace and dignity. The kind of person who didn't deserve what Derek Mullins had done to her. Word of the incident spread through town the way such things do. Whispered conversations at the grocery store, shared looks at the post office, muttered disapproval in church basements. People expressed their outrage in private, but did nothing in public. Derek Mullins continued his business as usual, dealing his pills, intimidating his customers, acting like nothing had happened because, to him, nothing had. He'd forgotten about Eleanor Castellano by lunchtime, moved on to other victims, other small cruelties that fed his sense of power. He had no idea that Eleanor had made a phone call that afternoon, her hands still trembling slightly as she dialed a number she'd memorized but rarely used. She'd told her son what happened, not to ask for help, but because she was shaken and needed to hear his voice. She'd assured him she was fine, that it was nothing, that he shouldn't worry. But mothers don't call their sons in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon to talk about nothing, and sons who've spent their lives in a certain kind of business know when something in a voice isn't right. He'd listened to what she didn't say as much as what she did, reading between the lines of her carefully chosen words. When she finally admitted what had happened, what Derek Mullins had done, the line had gone very quiet for a long moment before he told her he'd take care of it. I didn't know any of this at the time, of course. I was just another person in town, going about my business, trying to forget what I'd witnessed. But 3 days after the incident, I started noticing things. Strangers appearing in town, not tourists, not salesmen, but men who carried themselves with a particular kind of alertness that set them apart. They drove expensive cars with out-of-state plates, wore suits that were too nice for our small town, and asked questions in quiet voices. They were polite, these strangers, almost courtly in their manners, but there was something in their eyes that made smart people answer their questions quickly and honestly. They were looking for information about Derek Mullins, where he lived, where he worked, who his friends were, what his daily routine looked like. The bartender at Hannigan's told me later that 2 of them had come in, ordered expensive whiskey, and asked casual questions that felt anything but casual. The owner of the gym where Derek worked out reported the same thing. Even the girl who worked at the drive-through burger place mentioned a well-dressed man who'd ordered nothing but asked if she knew Derek Mullins. The net was closing, and Derek, stupid, arrogant Derek, had no idea he was being hunted. On the 4th day after the incident, a black Mercedes with New York plates pulled up to Eleanor Castellano's house. I know this because I lived 2 streets over, and my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had a view of Maple Street from her kitchen window, called me immediately. She was worried, she said, because she'd seen men in suits going into Eleanor's house, and she wanted to make sure the elderly woman was all right. I told her it was probably nothing, probably family, but I felt that same sick tightening in my stomach I'd felt in the diner. I walked over, not sure what I was going to do, but feeling like somebody should check. As I approached Eleanor's house, I saw them, 4 men in dark suits, standing on her porch, and Eleanor herself at the door, talking to someone I couldn't quite see. But I could hear the warmth in her voice, could see the way she reached up to touch someone's face with maternal tenderness. Then he stepped into view, and I understood everything. Vincent Castellano was not a tall man, but he carried himself with the kind of authority that made height irrelevant. He wore an impeccably tailored suit, his dark hair graying at the temples, his face lined with the kind of weathering that comes from difficult decisions and heavy burdens. But when he looked at his mother, those hard eyes softened into something almost boyish, something vulnerable and loving that seemed at odds with everything else about him. I recognized him immediately, not from personal encounter, but from news reports, from whispered rumors, from the kind of reputation that precedes a man like smoke before fire. Vincent Castellano ran a significant portion of the organized crime operations along the eastern seaboard. His name was associated with everything from loan sharking to labor racketeering to more serious matters that people only discussed in hushed tones. He was known to be intelligent, ruthless when necessary, and by the strange code of his world, a man of his word who honored the old traditions. He'd built his empire through a combination of violence and diplomacy, fear and respect, and he'd managed to avoid prison through a combination of excellent lawyers and witnesses who developed sudden amnesia. The FBI had been trying to build a case against him for years with little success. He was careful, insulated by layers of loyal subordinates who'd rather die than testify. And now he was here, in our small town, standing on his mother's porch, learning about what Derek Mullins had done. I backed away slowly, not wanting to be seen, not wanting to be anywhere near what was about to unfold. As I retreated, I saw Vincent lean down and kiss his mother's forehead, saw him speak to her with obvious tenderness, saw her nod and smile despite the fading bruise still visible on her cheek. Then he straightened, and the softness left his face entirely, replaced by something cold and purposeful that made me quicken my pace. The next morning, Derek Mullins didn't wake up in his apartment. He woke up in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, tied to a chair, his head throbbing from whatever they'd used to knock him unconscious. I know this because, months later, when enough time had passed and enough whiskey had flowed, one of the men who'd been there told me the story in fragments, in the kind of confession that comes from carrying something heavy too long. Derek had been taken cleanly, professionally, in the middle of the night, from his ground-floor apartment. No neighbors heard anything. No security cameras caught anything. He simply vanished, and by the time anyone noticed he was missing, it was far too late for it to matter. When Derek's head cleared enough to understand his situation, he found himself staring at Vincent Castellano, who sat calmly on a metal folding chair about 10 feet away, watching him with the detached interest of a scientist observing an insect. Behind Vincent stood 4 men, silent and still as statues, their faces expressionless. The warehouse was cold, empty except for some old machinery and the chair Derek was tied to. No one was coming to help him. No one even knew where to look. Vincent didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. He simply asked Derek if he knew why he was there, and when Derek, stupid to the end, tried to act tough, tried to bluster and threaten, Vincent had one of his men play a recording. It was security footage from Sal's diner, grainy but clear enough, showing Derek slapping Eleanor Castellano, showing him knocking her belongings to the floor, showing him and his friends laughing as they left. Derek's face went white as he watched, understanding flooding in too late, far too late. Vincent explained, in a calm and measured tone, exactly who Eleanor Castellano was, not just to the world, but to him. He talked about how she'd raised him alone after his father died when he was 7, how she'd worked 2 jobs to keep him fed and clothed, how she'd never missed a school play or a parent-teacher conference, despite her exhaustion. He talked about how she'd cried when he left town, how she'd begged him to stay away from the life he was choosing, how she'd prayed for his soul every day, despite knowing what he'd become. He talked about how she was the only truly good thing in his life, the only pure thing, the only reminder that he'd once been something other than what he was now. And Derek Mullins, small-time dealer and part-time bully, had put his hands on her, had humiliated her in public, had struck her across the face like she was nothing. Vincent stood up then, walked closer to Derek, and explained very carefully what was going to happen next. Derek would disappear, but not in the way he feared. Not immediately. First, every connection Derek had would be severed. Every dealer he knew would refuse to work with him. Every customer would be warned away. Every safe house would close its doors. Every friend would suddenly develop amnesia about ever knowing him. He would become a ghost in his own life, isolated and vulnerable. His bank accounts would empty mysteriously. His car would be repossessed for reasons no one could quite explain. His apartment lease would be terminated for violations he didn't commit. He would be systematically stripped of everything until he had nothing and no one, until he understood, truly understood, what it felt like to be helpless and alone and afraid. Only then, when he'd suffered sufficiently, when he'd learned the lesson Vincent wanted him to learn, would the final act come. Vincent told him all this in that same calm voice, like he was explaining a simple business transaction, while Derek wept and begged and promised things he couldn't deliver. Vincent listened to none of it. He'd already made his decision, and men like Vincent Castellano didn't change their minds once judgment had been passed. When Vincent finally left that warehouse, Derek was still alive, still tied to that chair, but already dead in every way that mattered. I watched it happen over the following weeks. Derek Mullins fell apart like a building with its foundations removed. First, he lost his connections, suddenly couldn't get product from his suppliers, couldn't move what he had left. Then his friends stopped answering his calls, stopped acknowledging him when they passed on the street. His landlord served him eviction papers. His car disappeared from the street where he'd parked it. He started looking gaunt, desperate, wild-eyed. He'd show up at places trying to make deals, trying to scrape together enough to survive, but doors closed in his face. Even the two friends who'd been with him at the diner vanished, left town suddenly with their families, relocating to places unknown for reasons they wouldn't discuss. Derek tried going to the police, tried reporting that he was being targeted, but what could he tell them? That people didn't want to do business with a small-time drug dealer anymore? That his friends had abandoned him? There was no crime to report, no evidence of anything actionable, just a man whose life was inexplicably falling apart. The police took his statement and did nothing because there was nothing to do. Derek was drowning in plain sight, and no one threw him a line. 6 weeks after the incident at Sal's diner, Derek Mullins disappeared for real. His apartment was found empty, his few remaining possessions scattered on the floor, like he'd left in a hurry or been taken in a hurry. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no evidence of violence, just an empty apartment and a man who was suddenly gone. The police investigated half-heartedly, interviewed a few people who claimed to know nothing, and eventually filed it away as a probable runaway situation. A drug dealer who'd burned too many bridges and decided to skip town before his debts came due. It was a common enough story. There was no body, no crime scene, no evidence of foul play, just another missing person in a world full of missing persons, someone who wouldn't be mourned by many and would be forgotten by most. His mother, living 3 states away, filed a missing person report that went nowhere. Whatever happened to Derek Mullins in those final hours, whoever knows the truth, they've kept their silence perfectly. The kind of silence that comes from fear, from loyalty, or from being paid extremely well to forget things. Vincent Castellano stayed in town for another week after Derek disappeared. He was seen visiting his mother daily, taking her to lunch, sitting with her in church, walking with her through her small garden. Neighbors reported that Eleanor seemed happy, more animated than she'd been in years, like having her son home had breathed new life into her. He fixed things around her house that had needed fixing, replaced a leaking faucet, repaired a section of fence, cleaned out her gutters. He was, by all accounts, a dutiful and loving son during those days, showing a side of himself that seemed incompatible with his reputation. The elderly women who lived near Eleanor told anyone who'd listen how polite he was, how he'd helped Mrs. Patterson carry her groceries, how he'd changed a flat tire for the young couple down the street. It was surreal watching one of the most feared criminals on the East Coast act like a normal man visiting his aging mother, but that's exactly what he was doing. On his final night in town, Vincent took Eleanor to dinner at Sal's diner, the same place where Derek Mullins had assaulted her. They sat in a booth by the window and Beth waited on them, receiving a tip that was probably more than she made in a week. Eleanor ordered her usual scrambled eggs and toast. Vincent ordered coffee and pie. They talked quietly, laughed occasionally, and to anyone watching they were just a mother and son sharing a meal. But everyone in that diner knew who he was by then, knew what he'd done, knew why Derek Mullins was missing. The message was clear, delivered without a word being spoken. Eleanor Castellano was under protection, and anyone who thought about harming her should look very carefully at what remained of Derek Mullins's life before making that mistake. The morning Vincent left town, I saw him say goodbye to his mother on her front porch. She held his face in her hands the way mothers do, kissed both his cheeks and said something that made him nod seriously. He embraced her carefully, mindful of her frailty, and I saw her whisper something in his ear. He pulled back, looked into her eyes, and shook his head slightly. Whatever she'd asked, whatever she'd hoped for, he couldn't promise her. Maybe she'd asked him to leave his life behind, to come home, to be the son she'd raised instead of the man he'd become. Maybe she'd asked him to forgive Derek Mullins, to show mercy, to let go of his vengeance. Whatever it was, he couldn't give it to her, and she seemed to accept that with the sad resignation of a mother who knows her son is beyond her reach. He helped her back inside, stayed a few more minutes, then emerged alone. His men were waiting by the cars, and he walked toward them without looking back. But just before he got in the Mercedes, he paused and turned, looking up and down the quiet street of this small town where he'd been born. His eyes swept across the houses, the trees, the church steeple visible in the distance. Then he got in the car, and they drove away, back to whatever waited for him in New York, back to the empire he'd built and the life he'd chosen. Eleanor stood at her window watching until the cars disappeared, one hand pressed against the glass, and I wondered what she was feeling in that moment: pride, sorrow, fear, love, or some complicated mixture of all of them. Life in town slowly returned to normal, or what passed for normal. Sal's diner continued serving breakfast. People went to work, raised their children, paid their bills. Eleanor Castellano resumed her quiet routine: church on Sundays, the library on Saturdays, the diner on Tuesdays and Thursdays. But something had changed in the way people treated her. There was a new deference, a careful respect that bordered on wariness. People went out of their way to help her, to be kind to her, to ensure she was all right. Not out of fear exactly, but out of an understanding that she was connected to something larger than our small town, something powerful and dangerous that could reach back if needed. The young punks who hung around the convenience store would immediately stub out their cigarettes and apologize for their language when she walked by. Shop owners gave her discounts without being asked. When her furnace broke that winter, 3 different contractors showed up unbidden to fix it, refusing payment. She'd become untouchable in a way that was both a protection and a kind of isolation. I wondered sometimes if she was lonely, if the new respect people showed her felt like a poor substitute for the simple human warmth that had existed before. But she never complained, never indicated that she noticed the change. She remained kind, gentle, dignified, the same person she'd always been, regardless of who her son was or what he'd done. I saw Eleanor one last time before I moved away from that town, pursuing a job opportunity in another state and eager to leave behind the memories of what I'd witnessed. It was a Tuesday morning, and she was sitting at the counter in Sal's diner, eating her scrambled eggs and wheat toast, drinking her black coffee. The bruise was long gone from her cheek, healed and faded like it had never been there at all. But I knew better. Some marks don't show on the skin. They go deeper, settling into memory and conscience. I thought about approaching her, about saying something, apologizing for my cowardice that day, telling her I wished I'd been brave enough to intervene, asking if she was truly all right. But I didn't. I stayed in my booth, drinking my coffee, watching her from a distance. She finished her meal, counted out her exact change with those trembling fingers, and walked out with her head high and her dignity intact. Through the window, I watched her navigate the sidewalk carefully, her small figure moving with determination despite her age. I never saw her again, but I heard later that she lived another 5 years, dying peacefully in her sleep at the age of 83. Vincent Castellano came back for her funeral. The whole town knew about it, and he buried her next to his father with a ceremony that was both modest and dignified, exactly as she would have wanted. He didn't stay long afterward, just a few hours to settle her estate and say his final goodbyes to the place that had made him and broken him in equal measure. Years have passed since that Tuesday morning in Sal's diner, but I still think about it sometimes, about Eleanor Castellano and the world she was connected to, about Derek Mullins and the casual cruelty that ended his life, about Vincent Castellano, and the terrible love that drove him to destroy a man for touching his mother. I think about how thin the line is between ordinary life and the violence that lurks just beneath its surface, how quickly everything can change because of one moment of meanness, one act of disrespect, one failure to recognize that every person you encounter is connected to someone who loves them, someone who might be willing to burn the world down to protect them. I think about the choices we make and the consequences that ripple outward from them in ways we can't predict or control. Derek Mullins woke up that Tuesday morning thinking he was somebody important, thinking he could push around an elderly widow without consequence, and by nightfall the machinery of his destruction was already in motion. He never understood that in this world there are debts that must be paid, scales that must be balanced, and some people who should never be touched, no matter how weak or helpless they appear. He learned that lesson far too late, in a cold warehouse or a shallow grave, or wherever his story finally ended. I don't know what happened to him, not really, and I don't want to know. Some knowledge is too heavy to carry, but I know this. When Vincent Castellano looked at his mother's bruised face, something shifted in the universe, and Derek Mullins's fate was sealed as certainly as if it had been written in stone from the beginning of time. The guilty were punished, the innocent protected, and justice, dark, brutal, extra-legal justice, was served. Whether that makes me feel better or worse about the world we live in, I honestly can't say. But the story didn't end with Eleanor's funeral, or with my departure from that small town. The ripples continued to spread, touching lives in ways none of us could have anticipated. About 2 years after I moved away, I received a phone call from Beth, the waitress from Sal's diner. We'd exchanged numbers before I left, a casual gesture of friendship that I'd assumed would fade into nothing the way most such connections do. But she kept my number, and one evening her voice came through my phone, sounding shaken and uncertain. She told me something had happened, something I needed to know about. A man had come into the diner asking questions about that Tuesday morning, about what had happened between Derek Mullins and Eleanor Castellano. He wasn't police, Beth was certain of that. He carried himself differently, spoke with a precision that suggested education and purpose. He'd shown her a badge that identified him as a federal agent, though she couldn't remember which agency exactly. The encounter had rattled her badly enough that she felt compelled to reach out to me, one of the few people who'd witnessed what she had witnessed and might understand the implications of federal interest in events we'd all tried so hard to forget. The agent had asked detailed questions about that morning. Who was present? What exactly Derek had done? Whether anyone had intervened or called the police, who Eleanor had spoken to afterward. Beth had answered truthfully but minimally, offering only what was directly asked and volunteering nothing. She'd learned that much from living in a town where people minded their own business. The agent had seemed particularly interested in the timeline of events following the incident, when the strangers in suits had appeared, what questions they'd asked when Derek had disappeared. He'd shown Beth photographs, asked her to identify people. Some faces she recognized from that week when Vincent's men had been in town. Others were unknown to her. The agent had been polite, even sympathetic, acknowledging that she'd done nothing wrong and was simply a witness to events beyond her control. But his questions carried weight, suggested a larger investigation. hinted at connections and consequences that extended far beyond our small town. Before he left, he'd given Beth his card and asked her to call if she remembered anything else or if anyone contacted her about their conversation. The card had gone into her purse, and she'd immediately felt the weight of being drawn into something dangerous, something with federal implications that could reshape her quiet life into something unrecognizable and threatening. I thanked Beth for telling me and advised her to be careful, to answer honestly if questioned again, but to volunteer nothing. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment staring at the wall, feeling that old familiar dread settling back into my chest. The past wasn't done with us. Vincent Castellano's act of vengeance, his protection of his mother, his systematic destruction of Derek Mullins, all of it had apparently drawn federal attention. I wondered what they were investigating exactly. Was it Derek's disappearance specifically, or had it become a thread in some larger case against Vincent and his organization? Were they building a RICO case, connecting various crimes across state lines, using Derek as one piece of a complex puzzle designed to finally bring down a man who'd eluded prosecution for decades? The questions multiplied in my mind, each one more troubling than the last. I thought about my own potential involvement, my status as a witness to the initial assault. Would federal agents come knocking on my door next, asking me to recount what I'd seen, to testify perhaps in some future trial? The prospect filled me with a complicated mixture of civic duty and visceral fear. I'd done nothing wrong, committed no crime, but I'd watched a man die, or effectively die, without saying a word to anyone in authority. Did that make me complicit somehow? Did my silence carry legal weight, moral consequence, karmic debt that would eventually come due? For weeks after Beth's call, I jumped at every unexpected knock on my door, every unfamiliar car that lingered too long on my street. I found myself checking over my shoulder, scanning crowds for faces that looked too attentive, too interested. Paranoia crept into my daily life like water seeping through a foundation, invisible at first, but gradually undermining everything. I wasn't sleeping well. My dreams populated by that Tuesday morning in the diner, by Eleanor's face after the slap, by Vincent Castellano's cold eyes assessing his mother's bruised cheek. The past had seemed safely buried, processed, and compartmentalized into a story I told myself about violence and justice and the complicated morality of revenge. But Beth's call had excavated it all, brought it back into the present tense, made it immediate and dangerous again. I started researching Vincent Castellano online, reading news articles about his organization, following reports of federal investigations into organized crime along the eastern seaboard. His name appeared frequently in connection with various criminal enterprises, always carefully distanced from direct involvement, always insulated by layers of subordinates and plausible deniability. The FBI had been targeting him for years with little success, their cases falling apart due to witnesses recanting testimony, evidence mysteriously disappearing, or prosecutors suddenly deciding not to pursue charges. He was, by all accounts, untouchable, protected by fear, loyalty, and excellent legal representation that knew how to exploit every procedural weakness in the federal system. 3 months after Beth's call, I finally received the visit I'd been dreading. 2 federal agents appeared at my door on a Saturday morning, both dressed in dark suits that seemed designed to announce their authority. They showed me their credentials, FBI, exactly as I'd suspected, and asked if they could come inside to talk. I let them in because refusing would have appeared suspicious and accomplished nothing. They were polite, professional, almost apologetic about the intrusion. The older agent, a man named Matthews with grey hair and tired eyes, did most of the talking. He explained that they were investigating several disappearances that appeared connected to Vincent Castellano's organization, and Derek Mullins was one of their cases. They knew I'd been present in Sal's diner that Tuesday morning, knew I'd witnessed the assault on Eleanor Castellano. They wanted to hear my account firsthand, understand exactly what had happened and what I'd observed in the days following. Matthews emphasized that I wasn't in any trouble, wasn't suspected of any wrongdoing, but my testimony could be crucial to their investigation. His partner, a younger woman named Chen, took notes while Matthews questioned me, her pen moving steadily across a legal pad as I recounted the story I'd carried for years. I told them everything I remembered: Derek's cruelty, Eleanor's dignity, the strangers who'd appeared asking questions, Derek's gradual disintegration, his eventual disappearance. I left nothing out because I sensed that partial truth would be more dangerous than complete honesty. When I finished, Matthews leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long moment. He asked if Vincent Castellano had ever contacted me, threatened me, or instructed me in any way about what to say or not say regarding these events. I told him no, which was the truth. Vincent had never acknowledged my existence. Matthews nodded, seemingly satisfied. Then he asked the question I'd been anticipating with dread. Would I be willing to testify in federal court if their investigation led to charges against Vincent Castellano? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. Testifying meant stepping fully into the light, becoming a named witness in a case against one of the most dangerous men on the East Coast. It meant potential retaliation, witness protection possibly, my life fundamentally altered by the weight of my civic duty. It meant standing in a courtroom and recounting these events under oath while Vincent Castellano sat at the defense table watching me with those cold, calculating eyes. But it also meant justice, real justice, the kind that operates through courts and laws rather than through warehouses and disappeared bodies. I thought about Eleanor Castellano, about her dignity and kindness. I thought about Derek Mullins, whose cruelty had started this chain of events, but who'd still been a human being deserving of due process rather than extrajudicial execution. I thought about the kind of person I wanted to be, the kind of society I wanted to live in. I told Matthews I would testify if required, and I saw something shift in his expression. Respect, maybe, or relief that this particular witness wasn't going to obstruct their investigation. He thanked me, gave me his card, and explained that they'd be in touch if the case progressed to trial. He also provided information about witness protection programs and security measures they could implement if I felt threatened at any point. The younger agent, Chen, looked up from her notes and met my eyes with an expression I couldn't quite read. Sympathy, perhaps, or concern for what I'd just committed myself to. They left shortly after, and I stood at my window watching their sedan pull away, wondering if I'd just signed my own death warrant or finally done the right thing after years of cowardly silence. The answer, I suspected, would depend on outcomes I couldn't control and forces I didn't fully understand. That night, I barely slept, my mind racing through possibilities and consequences, playing out scenarios of courtrooms and confrontations, of standing before justice and hoping it would protect those brave or foolish enough to serve it. I'd crossed a line by agreeing to testify, moved from passive witness to active participant in a drama whose conclusion remained terrifyingly uncertain. There was no going back now, no returning to the comfortable distance I'd maintained from these events for years. I was in it, fully and irrevocably, and whatever came next would have to be faced with whatever courage I could muster. The months that followed were a strange kind of limbo. I went about my daily life, work, errands, social obligations, while carrying the constant awareness that everything could change suddenly and violently. Matthews contacted me periodically with updates on their investigation. They were building a comprehensive case against Vincent Castellano, connecting multiple crimes across several years. Derek Mullins was just one piece of a much larger puzzle that included loan sharking, labor racketeering, witness tampering, and several other disappearances that bore the same hallmarks as Derek's. The FBI had informants within Vincent's organization now, people who'd been arrested on unrelated charges and chosen cooperation over loyalty. The case was progressing, Matthews assured me, though he couldn't provide specific details or timelines. Federal investigations of this magnitude moved slowly, methodically, building evidence layer by layer until the structure was solid enough to withstand the aggressive defense that men like Vincent Castellano could afford. I appreciated the updates, but found them more anxiety-inducing than reassuring. Each call from Matthews was a reminder that I was entangled in something dangerous, that my decision to cooperate had marked me as a potential target. I started varying my routines, taking different routes to work, paying attention to the people around me in ways I never had before. I wasn't living in terror exactly, but I wasn't living freely either. Then everything accelerated in ways I hadn't anticipated. Beth called again, her voice more urgent this time. She'd been contacted by someone claiming to work for Vincent Castellano, not threatening her explicitly, but making it clear that certain people were aware of her conversations with federal agents. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Talking to the FBI carried consequences. Beth was terrified, unsure whether to report the contact to Matthews or whether doing so would only escalate the situation. I advised her to call Matthews immediately, to document everything, to take the threat seriously. After we hung up, I called Matthews myself and reported what Beth had told me. His response was immediate and decisive. Within 24 hours, both Beth and I were offered entry into witness protection, at least temporarily, until they could assess the threat level and implement appropriate security measures. For Beth, still living in that small town where everyone knew everyone, the offer was both necessary and devastating. Accepting meant leaving behind her entire life, her job, her friends, everything familiar. For me, already living in a different state with fewer local ties, the disruption would be less severe but no less unsettling. We both accepted because the alternative, hoping that Vincent's people would leave us alone despite our cooperation, seemed dangerously naive. I packed essential items into 2 suitcases, left most of my possessions in storage, and moved to a safe house in a location I was instructed not to disclose to anyone. My employer was told I was dealing with a family emergency of indefinite duration. My few friends received vague explanations about needing to be out of touch for a while. The safe house was a modest apartment in a city I'd never visited before, bland and anonymous by design. 2 U.S. Marshals provided security, rotating shifts so that someone was always present or nearby. They were professional and courteous, but maintained appropriate distance. I was a protected witness, not a friend, and they took that distinction seriously. The isolation was immediate and oppressive. I couldn't contact anyone from my previous life without going through official channels. I couldn't work my regular job or maintain my normal routines. Days blurred into weeks with nothing to do but wait for updates on the case and wrestle with the consequences of my decision to cooperate. I read extensively, watched television without really seeing it, and thought far too much about roads not taken and choices that couldn't be unmade. Matthews visited every few weeks to update me on the investigation's progress and ensure I was holding up under the stress. The case was coming together, he reported, stronger than they'd hoped. They had documentary evidence, electronic surveillance, and multiple cooperating witnesses now. Vincent Castellano's protection was eroding as people within his organization chose self-preservation over loyalty. A federal grand jury had been convened and was hearing testimony. Indictments were likely within the next few months. Everything I'd been told about the careful, methodical pace of federal investigations was proving true, but that didn't make the waiting any easier. I was living in a kind of suspended animation, my entire existence on hold, while lawyers and agents built their case brick by brick towards some eventual confrontation in a federal courtroom. 6 months into my stay at the safe house, the indictments came down. Vincent Castellano and 14 members of his organization were charged with racketeering, conspiracy, witness tampering, and multiple counts of murder. Derek Mullins's disappearance was listed among the murder charges, though his body had never been recovered. The indictments made national news, a major organized crime figure finally brought to account after decades of operating with apparent impunity. I watched the news coverage with complicated emotions, relief that the case had progressed this far, vindication that my cooperation hadn't been for nothing, but also fear about what came next. The trial was scheduled to begin in 8 months, and Matthews confirmed I would be called as a witness to testify about the assault on Eleanor Castellano and its aftermath. That testimony would establish motive for Derek's murder and help demonstrate the pattern of violent retaliation that characterized Vincent's organization. It was crucial testimony, Matthews emphasized, because I was one of the few witnesses with no criminal history and no reason to lie or embellish. My credibility would be difficult for the defense to attack. I understood intellectually why my testimony mattered, but emotionally I was overwhelmed by the prospect of sitting in a witness box across from Vincent Castellano, of recounting these events under his gaze, of becoming the person who helped send him to prison for the rest of his life. The son who'd loved his mother enough to destroy a man for hurting her would now face justice because I'd been sitting in a diner that Tuesday morning and had finally decided that silence was no longer acceptable. The months leading up to the trial were spent in preparation. Federal prosecutors worked with me extensively, reviewing my testimony, anticipating defense questions, ensuring I understood courtroom procedures and protocols. They were thorough and professional, coaching me to answer only what was asked, to avoid speculation or interpretation, to stick to facts I could personally attest to. They prepared me for aggressive cross-examination, for attempts to impeach my credibility, for the emotional difficulty of testifying in such a high-profile case. Mock examinations helped me practice remaining calm under pressure, not letting defense attorneys provoke me into angry or defensive responses that could undermine my testimony's effectiveness. I appreciated their preparation, even as it amplified my anxiety about the actual trial. The prosecutors seemed confident in their case, optimistic about conviction, but they also cautioned that trials were inherently unpredictable. Vincent could afford the best defense attorneys money could buy, and they would exploit every weakness, challenge every witness, raise reasonable doubt wherever possible. Nothing was guaranteed. I would do my part by telling the truth clearly and convincingly, but the ultimate outcome would depend on 12 jurors evaluating evidence and testimony across what would likely be a multi-week trial. All I could control was my own performance on the witness stand, and even that felt like a tremendous burden to carry into the most important hours of my life. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in federal court. I wasn't called to testify for several days, but I attended the opening arguments as both preparation and obligation. The courtroom was impressive in its formality and weight, high ceilings, dark wood paneling, the seal of the United States lending governmental authority to the proceedings. Vincent Castellano sat at the defense table flanked by his attorneys, and I studied him from my seat in the gallery. He looked different than I remembered from that brief glimpse on his mother's porch years ago. Older, certainly, more worn by the stress of indictment and prosecution, but still projecting a kind of quiet authority that seemed incongruous with his status as criminal defendant. He listened attentively to the proceedings, occasionally leaning over to whisper to his lawyers, his expression controlled and unreadable. I wondered what he was thinking, whether he regretted the choices that had led him here, whether he thought about his mother and what she would have felt seeing her son on trial for murder. The lead prosecutor delivered opening statements that were methodical and damning, laying out a pattern of criminal conduct spanning decades, connecting Vincent to multiple crimes through documentary evidence and witness testimony. The defense attorney countered by attacking the credibility of cooperating witnesses, suggesting they were motivated by deals to reduce their own sentences, arguing that the government's case relied on the word of criminals who would say anything to save themselves. It was theatre and strategy and deadly, serious business all at once, and I sat there, absorbing it all while counting down the days until I would take the stand. When my turn finally came, I walked to the witness box with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The bailiff administered the oath, and I swore to tell the truth with my hand on a Bible, fully aware of the weight those words carried in this context. The lead prosecutor began with gentle preliminary questions: my name, where I lived at the time of the incident, why I'd been at Sal's diner that Tuesday morning. She established my credibility as a disinterested witness with no connection to any of the parties involved, just someone who happened to be present when Derek Mullins assaulted Eleanor Castellano. And then she walked me through the events methodically, what I'd witnessed, what I'd heard, what I'd observed in the aftermath. I described Derek slapping Eleanor, the sound of it, the mark it left on her face, the humiliation in her eyes. I testified about the strangers who'd appeared in town asking questions, about Derek's systematic isolation and eventual disappearance, about Vincent's visit to his mother and the message he'd sent by taking her to dinner at the same diner where she'd been assaulted. The prosecutor displayed photographs, the diner, Eleanor's house, even an old picture of Eleanor herself looking dignified and kind. Each image reinforced the narrative of a vulnerable elderly woman attacked by a bully and avenged by her powerful son. I kept my answers clear and factual, exactly as I'd been coached, resisting any urge to editorialize or interpret. My job was to present facts and let the jury draw their own conclusions about what those facts meant. The direct examination took nearly 2 hours, and through it all I felt Vincent's eyes on me, though I avoided looking directly at him. I didn't want to see his expression, didn't want to know whether he hated me or understood why I was doing this or felt anything at all about my betrayal, if you could call truthful testimony betrayal. Then came cross-examination, and the defense attorney came at me with precision and aggression. He questioned my memory of events from years ago, suggested that time had distorted my recollections, pointed out minor inconsistencies between my current testimony and statements I'd given to the FBI months earlier. He tried to establish that I'd been too far away in the diner to clearly see or hear everything, that I was reconstructing events based on what others had told me rather than personal observation. He asked whether I'd been offered any deals or incentives to testify, implying financial motivation or promises of immunity, despite having committed no crime. He questioned my decision to wait years before reporting these events to authorities, suggesting that my memory was convenient rather than accurate. Every question was designed to chip away at my credibility, to give jurors reason to doubt my testimony or dismiss it as unreliable. I held my ground, answering carefully, acknowledging when I was uncertain, but firmly maintaining the core facts of what I'd witnessed. The defense attorney was skilled and relentless, but he couldn't change the fundamental truth of what had happened that Tuesday morning. Eleanor Castellano had been slapped by Derek Mullins, Vincent Castellano had come to town, and Derek Mullins had disappeared. Those were facts no amount of aggressive questioning could erase. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 90 minutes, the cross-examination concluded and I was dismissed from the witness stand. I walked out of that courtroom feeling wrung out and emotionally exhausted, but also oddly relieved. I'd done what I'd agreed to do. I'd told the truth under oath. Whatever happened next was out of my hands, subject to forces larger than my individual testimony, but hopefully shaped by it in some small measure toward justice. The trial continued for another 3 weeks, without me. Other witnesses testified, federal agents who'd investigated Derek's disappearance, forensic accountants who'd traced financial records showing Vincent's control of criminal operations, former members of his organization who described the culture of violence and intimidation that kept everyone in line. The evidence was overwhelming, at least to my outsider perception, though I knew juries were unpredictable and convictions were never certain until jurors returned their verdict. I returned to the safe house and resumed waiting, checking news coverage obsessively, hoping for information about how the trial was progressing. Matthews called periodically to tell me my testimony had gone well, that the prosecutors were pleased, that the case continued to build toward what they hoped would be conviction on most, if not all, charges. Finally, after weeks of deliberation following closing arguments, the jury returned their verdict: guilty on racketeering, guilty on conspiracy, guilty on multiple counts of murder, including the murder of Derek Mullins despite the absence of a body, not guilty on a few lesser charges, but guilty on everything that mattered. Vincent Castellano stood without expression as the verdicts were read, showing nothing of what he must have felt hearing his life effectively end with those repeated declarations of guilt. Sentencing would come later, but the outcome was essentially predetermined. Life in federal prison without possibility of parole. The mandatory sentence for the crimes he'd been convicted of committing. The boy who'd left that small town decades ago to build a criminal empire was finally being held accountable, and I'd played a small but crucial role in making that accountability possible.